A quiet beginning. The airport thrummed with the energy of departure, each passenger caught up in the ebb and flow of the terminal. It was a dynamic place, constantly moving, yet somehow suspended in time, people hurrying to their gates, families reuniting, business travelers locked in their own worlds of last-minute preparations. The polished floors reflected hurried footsteps, the hum of luggage wheels on their journeys, and the soft announcement of flight statuses that fluttered in the background like an ever-present reminder of the passing moments. Among them, Alana Brooks moved with quiet purpose. She was not one to rush, not one to let the chaos pull her into its rhythm. Her presence cut through the busy terminal like a calm force, a striking figure in a sharp black suit that spoke to her professionalism, her confidence, and her unshakable sense of self. Her heels clicked in a steady cadence, the sound echoing with every step, but there was no anxiety in her movement. She wasn't in a rush. She was simply moving forward, and the world around her seemed to make space for her as she passed. Alana had become accustomed to walking through life with an unspoken weight, people's eyes tracking her every movement, whether they meant to or not. The assumptions, the judgments, the whispers that fluttered in the corners of rooms, they all came with the territory of being a black woman in a world that hadn't quite figured out how to handle her strength. She had learned long ago to carry herself with an air of confidence that bordered on defiance, an invisible armor she wore without ever thinking about it. She belonged in every space she entered, and she didn't need to ask for permission to occupy it. Her walk through the terminal, though effortless, was a delicate dance. She had mastered the art of holding her ground without being overt about it, a skill honed through years of navigating spaces that were often hostile to her existence. She knew the unspoken rules of these places, the way certain people expected her to shrink, to make herself smaller so they could feel more comfortable. But Alana wasn't interested in making anyone else comfortable. She was there for one reason only, to get to her flight, to take her seat, and to have a few quiet hours of peace before her hectic schedule began again. Her gaze briefly flicked toward the bustling crowd as she passed through the security checkpoint, her mind momentarily wandering to the week that had just passed. It had been a grueling one, a series of meetings that left her mentally exhausted, long nights spent drafting proposals, negotiating deals, and ensuring every detail was perfect. She'd given everything she had, and now all she wanted was a moment of rest. The plane would take her back home, where she could breathe for a few hours, far above the city's chaos, far from the demands of her career. It was a rare moment of solitude that she had earned, and she relished it. The first-class lounge was a sanctuary of quiet luxury, with its plush chairs, the soft clink of glassware, and the low murmur of other travelers. Alana didn't need the extravagance. She wasn't here for the attention or the show, it was the peace that she craved. As she walked past the reception desk, the staff greeted her with a nod, and she returned it with the kind of recognition that only those who are familiar with the unspoken protocols of the elite can understand. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone said everything. Sitting down at a corner, she scanned the room, her eyes moving over the faces around her. Most of them were absorbed in their phones or laptops, lost in their own little worlds. Businessmen reviewing reports, families catching up before their departure, and a few others who, like her, sought quiet respite before the inevitable rush of air travel. The faint smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air as Alana settled into her seat, stretching her legs out before her. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for a brief moment, imagining the tranquility of the flight that lay ahead. Her thoughts were interrupted by the call for boarding. Alana rose to her feet, gathering her things in a fluid motion. She wasn't in a hurry. There was no need to rush. She had time, and she intended to use it. Her hand brushed against the strap of her bag as she made her way to the gate, each step a measured decision, each movement a reaffirmation of her self-assurance. As she reached the gate, she was met with a sudden flash of unease, a small prickling sensation at the back of her mind, like a whisper she couldn't quite make out. She paused at the entrance of the boarding tunnel, looking around. There was no particular reason for the discomfort, but the air felt heavier, the buzz of activity sharper, almost too focused. It was subtle, but Alana knew better than to ignore such feelings. She had learned to trust her instincts, especially when they told her that something wasn't quite right. The gate attendant greeted her with a polite smile, scanning her ticket quickly, before waving her toward the jet bridge. Alana nodded and made her way forward, but the prickling sensation remained, following her as she stepped onto the plane. She didn't look around too much, but the moment she walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of eyes on her. She could always tell when they were watching, always feel the discomfort in the air, the unspoken disbelief that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her seat, 1A, was located at the front of the cabin, the coveted spot of the first-class section. It was more than just a seat, it was her personal space of refuge, a place to unwind, to reflect, and to prepare for whatever the next days held. She set her bag down, adjusting her seat and settling into the plush chair. As the flight attendants moved about, she gave them a small nod of acknowledgement. She wasn't here to draw attention. She just wanted a peaceful flight. But as the last few passengers boarded, Alana felt the disturbance once more. It wasn't the usual quiet hum of boarding. No, this felt different, a palpable shift in the air, the kind that only happens when something's about to change. She couldn't explain it, but she sensed the unease in the way the flight attendants moved, the way they glanced at her as they passed. Alana leaned back, her fingers brushing over the armrest as she tried to shake off the feeling. Perhaps it was nothing. Maybe she was just tired. The hustle and bustle of her week had taken its toll. She closed her eyes, letting the low hum of the plane's engines soothe her, hoping that the gentle motion would calm the storm brewing in her mind. Little did she know, this flight, this moment of anticipated peace, was about to become the stage for something that would shake not only her world, but the entire cabin. What was meant to be a simple journey home would soon turn into a battle for dignity, one that would ripple through the airline and leave its mark on all those who witnessed it. And it would start with a simple question: can I see your ticket again? The first question. The soft hum of the plane's engines began to rise as it taxied down the runway, and Alana settled deeper into her seat, her eyes closed as she leaned back against the plush headrest. The feeling of weightlessness, the gentle vibration of the plane, and the murmur of the cabin made her feel as though she were being lifted out of her own busy world, if only for a few hours. The bright lights of the terminal and the noise of the airport seemed like distant memories now, far below her as she ascended into the clouded skies. This was the peace she had longed for. But even amidst the comfort of first class, there was a quiet unease that lingered in the air. She tried to push it down, to drown out the tension that seemed to seep into her bones, but it refused to go away. The cabin, despite its luxuries, felt strangely charged, as if everyone aboard was waiting for something. Her intuition prickled, but she couldn't put her finger on why. As the flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisles, preparing the cabin for takeoff, Alana's eyes fluttered open again, her attention shifting toward the small details around her. The cabin crew, though still calm and poised, seemed slightly off, like they were moving too quickly, with too much purpose. She could hear their soft exchanges, murmurs that barely registered above the sound of the plane's engines, but something about their energy didn't sit right. The plane finally reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt signs clicking off. For a brief moment, Alana thought the tension would finally dissipate. The overhead lights dimmed, signaling the time for passengers to relax, recline, and prepare for the hours ahead. The flight attendants started to circulate with the drink cart, offering beverages to the seated passengers. The low murmur of polite conversation filled the cabin as people relaxed into their journey. But it was then that the disturbance broke the surface. "Excuse me, ma'am," a soft, tentative voice cut through the gentle buzz of the cabin. Alana turned her head slowly, meeting the gaze of a young flight attendant, no older than 25. She had the look of someone trying too hard to be overly professional, her posture stiff and her smile tight, as though forced into a role she was struggling to embody. She looked at Alana with wide eyes, holding a small stack of papers in her hands. Alana's brow furrowed slightly, unsure of the interruption. She hadn't ordered anything, nor had she requested any assistance. There was nothing in her demeanor that suggested she needed help. But the flight attendant stood there, as if waiting for something, perhaps some sign, some acknowledgement. "Can I see your ticket again?" the flight attendant asked, her voice polite but with a subtle undertone of uncertainty. Alana blinked, surprised by the request. She had already been scanned at the gate, and no other passenger had been asked for a ticket check on this flight. She held up her boarding pass with a small, deliberate gesture, but something inside her shifted. There was a feeling, an underlying tone to the way the attendant spoke, that didn't sit right with her. "Of course," Alana said, her voice calm but questioning as she handed the ticket over, sensing that something was unfolding just beneath the surface. The attendant took it, but instead of simply verifying it and moving on, she hesitated, her fingers nervously tracing the edges of the paper. There was something about her body language that Alana picked up on immediately, a flicker of doubt, a hesitation, as though she wasn't entirely sure of what she was doing. The attendant scanned the boarding pass again, her eyes darting over the printed details. For a moment, Alana wondered if it was an error with the system, a mistake in the airline's check-in process. After all, mistakes happened. But as the attendant glanced down at the ticket once more, her fingers lingered on the edges, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry," the flight attendant said finally, her voice a little too loud in the otherwise quiet cabin. "There seems to be a problem with your seat. This seat should be assigned to someone else." Alana's stomach tightened slightly. This wasn't just a simple confusion. It was an insinuation, an assumption that there was a problem with her being in this particular seat. She could feel the shift in the energy around her as her eyes locked with the flight attendant's. "No," Alana replied, her voice firm but measured, the calmness belying the tension simmering just beneath. "I've checked my ticket already. This is my seat." The flight attendant didn't seem convinced, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin, as if looking for something, some kind of validation. Alana knew this look well. It was the look of someone who didn't want to question authority, who didn't want to push too hard against a system that could easily dismiss them. But Alana wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. "I'm sure there's some mistake," the attendant said, but her voice wavered slightly now. "I'll need to speak with the captain to confirm." Alana remained still, her gaze fixed on the attendant. She wasn't going to argue or raise her voice. But this was not the kind of mistake she was willing to tolerate. She could feel the other passengers' eyes on her now, their attention subtly shifting in her direction. Some pretended not to notice, while others gave subtle glances, curious about what was unfolding. "Fine," Alana said, keeping her tone even. "Please let the captain know that I'm not moving until this is resolved." The flight attendant nodded, clearly caught off guard by Alana's assertiveness. She turned quickly, her heels clicking on the floor as she hurried down the aisle toward the cockpit. Alana's mind raced as she watched her leave, her thoughts circling back to the reason behind the confrontation. It was clear that something had triggered this, but what? Alana leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the cabin. The moment the flight attendant had approached her, the atmosphere had shifted. The other passengers seemed to be waiting for something to happen, some kind of resolution, perhaps, or a confrontation. She wasn't sure which. But Alana wasn't just a passive observer. She had lived too many years in a world where the smallest assumptions could create huge barriers. Where people like her were often questioned when no one else was. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slide. The minutes seemed to stretch on as the attendant returned with a senior crew member, a man in his late 50s, his uniform pristine and his demeanor stern. His eyes locked onto Alana's for a brief moment before he turned to speak to the flight attendant in hushed tones. The murmurs didn't escape Alana's notice. They were speaking about her, about the situation, about the problem that no one had bothered to explain to her. She could feel it now, that subtle shift. The captain would be involved soon. They would attempt to exert their authority, to maintain control of the situation. But what they didn't realize was that Alana wasn't just any passenger. She had fought for everything she had. Every inch of space, every opportunity, every moment where she had been doubted, had only strengthened her resolve. The crew seemed to have forgotten that fact. Minutes passed before the senior crew member approached her seat with a level of formality that only made the situation feel more surreal. The flight attendant, now at his side, looked uncertain, her hands twisting together in front of her. They had both been thrown off balance by Alana's calm resistance. "Ma'am," the senior crew member began, his voice polite but firm, "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to vacate this seat. There has been a misunderstanding with your booking. This seat is assigned to another passenger." Alana didn't move, didn't even blink. Her eyes never left his as she responded, her voice steady and resolute. "I've checked my booking, and this is my seat," she said, every word laced with a quiet power that rang through the tense air. The senior crew member's face flushed slightly, the beginning of frustration creeping into his expression. He had clearly expected a different response, perhaps compliance, perhaps even a meek retreat from the request. But Alana wasn't retreating. "Not today. I understand that you may be confused, but there is no mistake," she said, her voice growing a fraction louder, just enough to carry the weight of her words to the passengers around her. "I'm not moving until you show me a reason why I should." The cabin had fallen eerily quiet by now. The other passengers, who had been attempting to ignore the scene unfolding in front of them, were now paying attention. The unease that had lingered in the air earlier seemed to settle into a quiet tension, like the calm before a storm. Alana sat still, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She was not just standing up for herself. She was standing up for something much bigger, something that she would not let go unchallenged. The battle for dignity. The senior crew member's face turned an even deeper shade of red as Alana's words reverberated through the quiet cabin. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut through with a knife. It wasn't just the usual mid-flight conversation that hummed through the air. No, this was something more intense. Alana could feel the eyes of every passenger locked on her, some of them with curiosity, others with silent judgment, but all of them watching. The senior crew member stood for a moment, seemingly weighing his options. His expression was one of frustration and disbelief, as though he couldn't fathom that a passenger, especially a black woman, alone and so poised, would dare to challenge the authority of a flight crew. His hand tightened slightly around the paperwork in his hand, and his lips pressed into a thin line. The flight attendant beside him shifted nervously on her feet. Alana could feel her discomfort. The girl was caught in a situation she didn't know how to handle, unsure of how to proceed when the rules she had followed blindly her entire career no longer seemed to apply. "You understand, ma'am," the senior crew member began, his voice colder now, "that we have procedures to follow. If your seat is assigned to someone else, we cannot simply overlook that." Alana remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle in. Procedures. Rules. She had heard them all before, in countless other spaces, from countless other people who tried to use their authority to force her into submission. These were the words they used to justify mistreatment, to make her feel small, to push her into corners where she didn't belong. "Let me be clear," Alana said, her voice low but steady, "I'm not going anywhere unless you can show me that I'm in the wrong. You can keep citing procedures, but I am telling you that this is my seat. I've already checked. I've already confirmed. And until you can prove otherwise, I'm staying." The crew member's eyes narrowed, and he gave a curt nod, as though accepting the challenge. But there was something in his expression, a flicker of something that betrayed a small measure of doubt. He wasn't sure what to do next, and for the first time, it was clear that he was losing control of the situation. In the quiet of the cabin, the voices of the other passengers had disappeared. It was as though the entire plane had held its breath, waiting for the next move. Some passengers exchanged glances, others seemed to brace themselves for the fallout. The flight attendants, now standing rigidly at the back, watched in stunned silence. It was as if the room itself had shifted, had become a stage for a drama no one had expected. The senior crew member turned away for a moment, stepping back and whispering something to the flight attendant. His shoulders were tense, his eyes flicking back to Alana before returning to the young woman by his side. Alana couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear, an attempt to figure out what to do, an attempt to regain control. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this before, the moment when someone in a position of power realizes they can't simply steamroll over you, when their usual methods of intimidation no longer have the desired effect. It was a feeling she knew too well. She had lived through it time and time again, in boardrooms, in meetings, and in places where she wasn't expected to be. But Alana wasn't just a passenger on this flight. She wasn't just another person who could be dismissed. She had learned that her presence alone could be a force. It wasn't just about fighting for this seat. It was about fighting for the dignity that too often got erased in the spaces she occupied. It was about challenging the quiet, insidious ways that people like her were made to feel like they didn't belong. And if that meant standing her ground here, at 30,000 feet, then so be it. The captain's voice suddenly crackled through the intercom, breaking the silence like a bomb going off. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're just about to begin our in-flight services, but we ask that you remain in your seats and keep your seatbelt fastened. There will be a slight delay as we handle an issue on board. We appreciate your understanding and cooperation. Alana's eyes flicked to the senior crew member, who was now standing by the cabin door, waiting for the captain's arrival. She could feel the atmosphere shift again. This was no longer just about a simple seating mistake. This had escalated beyond that. The captain was coming down. They were bringing the authority of the entire flight crew to bear against her, thinking that would settle the matter. But Alana wasn't afraid. She had faced far greater battles than this in her life. She wasn't intimidated by a man in a uniform or by people who tried to reduce her to a stereotype. She had fought for her place in every room, in every institution, and she would fight for it now, just as fiercely. The minutes stretched on, each one dragging on with suffocating heaviness. And then the door to the cockpit opened. The captain stepped through, a tall man with a composed expression, his uniform impeccably pressed. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly before locking onto Alana, who still sat firmly in her seat, unwavering. "Ma'am," the captain said, his voice smooth, almost patronizing, "I understand there's been a misunderstanding with your seat assignment." Alana didn't respond immediately. She took a moment to size him up, noticing the way his eyes flicked over her once, then moved away, clearly not expecting her to challenge his authority. His presence alone seemed to command respect, as though his mere existence in that space would automatically make her defer to him. But Alana had learned to read these cues, to see through the false layers of politeness and pretense. She wasn't about to let his title intimidate her, not when her own dignity was on the line. "Captain," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I've already shown your crew my ticket. I'm not here by mistake. I'm not in someone else's seat. I'm in the seat that was assigned to me. If there's a mistake, you need to show me proof. Otherwise, I'm staying right here." The captain's brow furrowed slightly, and for the first time, Alana saw a flash of uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't what he had expected. He had likely assumed that his uniform would be enough to silence her, to make her back down. But she wasn't the type to simply comply because someone told her to. "Ma'am, I need to insist that you move," the captain said, his voice growing a little colder now, a hint of authority slipping through. "We have protocols for situations like this." Alana took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. There was a silence that stretched between them now, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about respect. It was about power. And it was about the recognition that she, too, had a right to be in this space, without question, without hesitation. "I've already told your staff that I'm not moving until I'm given a valid reason," Alana said, her voice growing sharper now, a steel edge creeping into her tone. "I'm not asking you to do me a favor. I'm asking you to show me why you think I don't belong here. If you can't, I'm staying right where I am. And I won't tolerate any more of this nonsense." The cabin was completely silent now. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. The captain stood still for a long moment, his gaze locked on Alana, as though trying to assess the situation. He opened his mouth to speak again, but before he could utter another word, a voice broke the silence. "Is everything all right here?" a new voice called out from the aisle. Alana turned to find another figure standing there. This time, it was a man, a middle-aged passenger who had been seated a few rows behind her. His voice was calm, but there was a certain authority in it, as though he had been watching the exchange unfold with growing discomfort. The captain paused, glancing at the man. "Yes, we are handling a minor issue," the captain said, his voice more strained now, "but it's being resolved." The man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Alana, then back at the crew. "I don't think this needs to go any further," he said quietly, his gaze shifting between Alana and the captain. "This lady is right. If you can't provide evidence of a problem, then she should be left alone." The senior crew member at the back of the plane shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by the intervention. But the man's words hung in the air like a challenge. Alana couldn't help but feel a flicker of surprise, and something else, inside her. It was rare for someone else to speak up in a situation like this. In fact, it was almost unheard of. But here, in this space, with all the weight of her dignity on the line, a stranger had decided to stand with her. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The power dynamics had changed, subtly but decisively. Alana wasn't alone in this fight anymore. And that, more than anything, was what made her resolve even stronger, unraveling the silence. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, the kind of weight that comes with confrontation, a silent battle unfolding in real time. Alana felt the stirrings of something fierce in her chest as she absorbed the unexpected support from the man behind her. It wasn't much, but in a world where many would look the other way, where so often people were conditioned to stay quiet and comply, his words held an undeniable power. It wasn't just about this moment, or this seat, anymore. It was about something bigger, a silent rebellion against the small injustices that, over time, chipped away at dignity. The captain, though still holding his composure, shifted uneasily. Alana could see the way his grip tightened around the edges of his jacket, as though he was recalibrating. A small knot formed in the pit of her stomach as she realized that this wasn't just a momentary lapse. The power struggle had escalated far beyond just the seat assignment, it was now a battle for authority itself. And the reality of the situation was settling in. The flight crew had underestimated her. She glanced around the cabin again, noticing the passengers' furtive glances. The man who had spoken up was still standing, facing the captain now, his jaw set in quiet defiance. The tension in the air thickened, and the hum of the plane seemed to amplify as everyone waited for something to break the silence. Even the flight attendants, who had been standing near the back, now kept their distance, their gaze flicking between Alana and the captain as though unsure of where this confrontation would lead. "You're right," the captain said after a moment, his voice clipped and more defensive now. "This is not the time for an argument. But I insist that we follow protocol." Alana raised an eyebrow, her mind working quickly. It was clear now that the captain wasn't so much concerned about the protocol itself. He was concerned about being challenged, about losing face in front of the passengers. This wasn't about a mistake with the seat, it was about his authority being questioned in front of a cabin full of people. "Protocol?" Alana repeated, leaning forward slightly. What protocol are you referring to? You've yet to present any legitimate reason as to why I shouldn't be here. The captain took a steadying breath, trying to maintain control, but the cracks were beginning to show. There was a flicker in his eyes, the realization that the situation had spun beyond his grasp, and the knowledge that his response could no longer be about just defending a seat assignment. We are investigating the issue, he said, his tone taking on a more authoritative edge. I will ask that you wait here while we resolve the matter. If you continue to refuse to comply, I will have to take further steps. Alana stared at him, her gaze unwavering, holding the weight of her stance. She wasn't going to be intimidated. She had fought too hard in her life to be silenced now. Further steps, she asked, her voice cool, controlled. What kind of further steps? What would you do? Force me to move? Call security? The captain paused, his eyes narrowing, but Alana wasn't finished. The corner of her mouth lifted into the faintest of smiles, almost a challenge. I'm telling you now, Captain, she said, her voice rising just enough to be heard clearly, there is no reason for me to leave this seat. I've already shown you my ticket. You've already double-checked it. And yet, here we are, you're still trying to find a way to prove I don't belong. If you want to waste more of my time, go ahead. But know this, I won't back down. And I won't let anyone else be made to feel as if they don't belong here either. The captain's eyes flashed with something unreadable, a mixture of irritation, disbelief, and perhaps even a hint of fear. It wasn't the kind of emotion one expected to see on a man who had spent years in charge of a flight. But it was there, unmistakable. And that was the moment Alana realized she had done something. She had shifted the power dynamic, not just in the cabin, but within herself. She had resisted, and in doing so, she had forced him to see her, not just as a passenger, not just as someone to be controlled, but as an equal. As a force to be reckoned with. Behind her, the man who had spoken up earlier shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful. He took a step forward, as though positioning himself to offer support if needed. The other passengers, still silent, watched, the tension in the cabin palpable. Some passengers seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that the issue at hand wasn't just about a seat, it was about something much more personal. It was about dignity. It was about respect. The captain's voice came again, but this time, it was different. There was a faint trace of humility in it. Please remain in your seat, he said, his words clipped. I'll have this resolved immediately. I'll contact ground crew for verification. The flight attendants, who had been standing by the doors, now stepped forward, exchanging uncertain glances. They too were caught in the web of tension that had spun out of control. For the first time, the hierarchy that had been so rigid seemed to bend under the weight of Alana's quiet resolve. The crew had been forced to recognize the gravity of the moment. They were no longer dealing with an issue of seating arrangements. They were dealing with a woman who refused to be made small. And that was something they hadn't anticipated. Alana leaned back in her seat, feeling the smallest stir of triumph. It was a quiet victory, one that didn't need to be shouted. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all the crew. She had already won by standing her ground. The plane continued its smooth course through the sky, the engines humming in the background, but Alana's mind was alive with a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a simple misunderstanding had now become a catalyst for something larger. This wasn't just about her fight for a seat. It was about the refusal to be disregarded, to be dehumanized. And there was something deeply empowering about that realization. In the few moments before the captain made his call to ground crew, the cabin returned to a strained silence. Alana could feel the weight of the passengers' gazes on her, some with admiration, some with unease, but all recognizing the shift in power that had taken place. And then, almost as if on cue, the captain's voice returned to the intercom, cutting through the silence once more. This time, there was no pretension in his words, no attempt to assert his authority. There was only a quiet acceptance of what had just transpired. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice said, this time without the usual bravado, "we have verified the seating arrangements. There was an error in the system that led to confusion regarding this passenger's seat assignment. I apologize for the inconvenience." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy and unexpected. It wasn't an apology for the treatment of Alana, not directly. It was a technical explanation, a way of diffusing the situation without fully acknowledging the core of the conflict, the systemic disrespect that had triggered it in the first place. But Alana wasn't concerned with that. What mattered was that the matter had been resolved. The passengers shifted in their seats, some visibly relaxing, while others exchanged looks of quiet disbelief. The cabin crew, too, seemed to exhale collectively, their tension dissipating in the wake of the announcement. They had been caught in a moment of discomfort, unsure of how to handle someone who wasn't going to just accept the status quo. Alana sat still, her back straight, her expression one of calm resolve. She had done what she had set out to do. She had stood firm in the face of injustice and had forced them to see her as an equal, as a person deserving of respect. And the consequences of that moment would ripple through the cabin, through the crew, and perhaps even through the airline itself. Because for the first time, they had been forced to recognize something they hadn't expected, the quiet, unwavering power of a woman who knew her worth and wasn't afraid to demand it. A ripple of change. The cabin's atmosphere had shifted significantly in the wake of the captain's announcement. The air, once thick with tension, now seemed lighter, almost charged with a new energy. But Alana knew that the moment she had created was far from over. It had left a ripple in the cabin, a ripple that had yet to fully settle, one that would undoubtedly linger well after the flight ended. She had not just fought for a seat, nor had she merely challenged an error in seating. She had stood up for something far greater. And now, it was impossible for anyone on board to ignore the consequences. She leaned back in her seat, taking a deep breath. Her heart was still pounding from the exchange, but there was a sense of calm that was beginning to settle in her chest. For the first time in a long while, she felt proud not just for how she had handled the situation, but for what her stance represented. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had made herself and everyone around her aware of a truth that couldn't be ignored: she was entitled to dignity. Not just because she was a paying passenger on a flight, but because she existed in a world that often sought to make people like her shrink into the background. And now, the rest of the cabin had seen her fight. She had fought not just for her rights, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small in the face of authority, who had ever been overlooked or marginalized. The senior crew member, who had initially tried to dismiss Alana with his dismissive authority, now stood near the back of the plane, his posture stiff. He hadn't spoken since the captain's announcement, but his eyes kept flicking toward her, almost as if trying to figure out whether this moment had meant anything at all. It was clear that he, too, had been affected by the confrontation. His demeanor had shifted from rigid confidence to quiet discomfort. He had been forced to acknowledge that he was no longer the one in control. The balance of power had shifted, and he wasn't sure how to reclaim it. Alana's gaze shifted around the cabin, noticing the way the other passengers were reacting. Some seemed lost in thought, still processing what had just happened. Others exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they slowly came to terms with the fact that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Many had been quiet throughout the ordeal, content to watch from the sidelines, unsure of how to engage in the situation. But something in the way Alana had held her ground seemed to have awakened a quiet solidarity within them. A few rows back, she noticed a young woman sitting with her arms crossed, watching Alana with a look of admiration. Their eyes met for a moment, and the young woman gave her a small nod, as if to say, "Thank you." It wasn't a loud, dramatic show of support, but it was enough. Alana understood the weight of that small gesture. It was recognition, acknowledgement that the fight she had waged was not just her own. It was a shared struggle, one that reached beyond the confines of this flight and into the broader landscape of power dynamics, inequality, and personal agency. The flight attendants, who had been standing back near the kitchen area, now moved about with more hesitance. Their interactions with passengers were still professional, but there was a subtle shift in their energy. They were more aware now, perhaps more attuned to the reality that the status quo wasn't always as unbreakable as they had once assumed. The woman who had been the first to approach Alana earlier, the one who had seemed unsure and nervous, now glanced toward Alana with a faint smile as she passed by. It was a small acknowledgement, but it spoke volumes. The captain, too, had not spoken for some time, as if still processing the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. There had been no further mention of the seating issue after the announcement, no additional directives. He seemed to have retreated to his own thoughts, perhaps contemplating the repercussions of what had just transpired. It was clear that this incident would not be easily forgotten, and it was likely that those involved would be discussing it long after the flight had ended. The airline, after all, had been publicly called out, and there were few things more jarring than the collective realization that something wrong had occurred and that it had been witnessed by dozens of people. The minutes passed, the plane continuing its journey across the sky, but Alana's thoughts were racing. She had expected the confrontation to be challenging, but she hadn't anticipated the level of ripple it would create. She could already sense that this moment, this small but significant action, would not only affect her, but everyone who had witnessed it. It was funny, she thought. Most people wouldn't even remember this flight in a week's time. They would move on to their next destination, back to their daily routines, and this would become another forgotten moment in the long list of inconsequential experiences that make up an ordinary life. But for her, this wasn't just a fleeting moment. This was a turning point, a moment that would echo through the spaces she inhabited, a declaration of what she would tolerate and what she would not. For Alana, this was more than just a personal victory. It was a message to the world, a world that often tried to reduce her to an afterthought. She had made a stand in the most public of ways, in a space where authority tried to dictate the rules, and she had won. It wasn't just about defying a flight attendant. It was about defying every system that tried to make her, and others like her, feel invisible, unworthy, or incapable of demanding respect. And in this moment, as the plane flew high above the clouds, Alana realized something else. She didn't need to fight every battle. She didn't need to prove herself every time. This moment, this one instance, was enough. The small acts of resistance, the ones that seem insignificant to the outside world, are the ones that build the foundation for greater change. And for the first time in a long time, Alana felt at peace. She wasn't just fighting against injustice, she was standing in solidarity with a future that would one day recognize the power in every person's voice, no matter their race, gender, or background. Her action, small as it may have seemed to some, was a seed planted in a world that sorely needed more of them. As the flight continued, the hours passed, and the landscape outside the window shifted from clouds to the first glimmers of sunset. It was an ordinary flight for most of the passengers, but not for Alana. She had made history in her own quiet way. And she knew that when this flight was over, when she left that plane, she would walk off it with a strength that she hadn't had when she boarded. She had stood up not just for herself but for all the others who couldn't. For the people who were told to sit down, to stay quiet, to take what was given to them and never ask for more. She had disrupted the calm of the sky, and in doing so, had reminded everyone that real change begins in the most unexpected of places, the aftermath and the legacy. As the plane descended toward its final destination, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the energy had shifted. It was no longer just a plane filled with passengers on their way to various points on the map. The mood, once again, had altered, this time in a way that suggested an undercurrent of contemplation, of people piecing together the events they had witnessed. The journey was nearing its end, but the ripples from the confrontation Alana had sparked would continue to resonate long after the plane had landed. Alana felt the weight of the moment settle on her as she gazed out the window. The sun, now dipping low on the horizon, cast a golden light across the clouds, creating a tranquil scene. But inside her, there was a sense of quiet triumph, an unwavering certainty that what had happened was not just important for her, but for something larger. She hadn't just won a personal victory, she had altered the narrative, if only for a brief moment. The power dynamics had shifted in a way that could never be undone. As the plane began its final approach, Alana's thoughts swirled. What had she truly achieved? Was it enough to challenge an institution with so much entrenched power? Could one woman's resistance really lead to lasting change? She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: her actions had not gone unnoticed. The flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, and the captain's voice came over the intercom once again, this time with a calmer, more neutral tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our destination. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are in their upright positions. Thank you for your cooperation throughout the flight." Alana's seatbelt clicked into place, but her mind was elsewhere. She had a sense that something was about to change, something beyond the immediate flight experience, beyond her small personal victory. The entire cabin had witnessed her stand firm, and now they were all part of something bigger. The story of what had happened during this flight, though it may have seemed like a single incident, had planted the seed for a larger conversation. People didn't simply forget moments like this. They lingered in the collective memory, shaping the way people saw the world and themselves. As the plane taxied to the gate, the other passengers started to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. Alana stood slowly, feeling the weight of her actions still in her bones. But it wasn't just her actions she was reflecting on, it was the realization that she had sparked a broader awareness. She had made her statement, not through grand gestures or loud declarations, but through quiet, resolute action. She had demanded respect, not just for herself, but for all the others who had felt overlooked, undervalued, and silenced. She turned to glance around the cabin once more. There, at the back, she saw the same young woman who had nodded at her earlier. This time, the young woman was standing with a couple of friends, and as their eyes met, she mouthed a quiet, "Thank you." Alana offered a brief smile in return. That one simple gesture was a reminder of why she had done what she did. This wasn't just about standing up to a flight attendant or proving a point, it was about making space for others, lifting them up so they could see that they too could stand their ground. It was a moment of solidarity, one that transcended race, gender, and background. It was a shared experience of empowerment. The flight attendants, too, seemed different. They moved more deliberately now, no longer in their earlier, disjointed routine. There was a subtle shift in the way they interacted with passengers as they gathered their things, the tight, almost defensive energy replaced by something softer, more aware. It was as though they had learned something in the course of the flight, something important, though unspoken. They had witnessed the courage it took to defy authority and stand firm in the face of unfairness, and in doing so, they had learned that the rules they once thought were absolute were, in fact, malleable. As Alana made her way down the aisle, she caught the eye of the senior crew member who had been involved in the confrontation. He avoided her gaze at first, but then, just as she was about to pass him, he cleared his throat and said, I want to apologize again for the confusion earlier. I didn't handle the situation well." His voice was quiet, almost reluctant, but there was sincerity in it. Alana paused, surprised by the apology. She had expected deflection, maybe even further excuses. But instead, this man had acknowledged his role in what had unfolded, and that, she realized, was a small but significant step. "There's nothing to apologize for," she said calmly. "But I do hope this situation makes you think differently about how you handle things in the future." She gave him a small, steady smile before walking past him, leaving the interaction with a sense of resolution. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was enough. She had shown him, in no uncertain terms, that respect was not a privilege, it was a right. And in turn, he had shown her that even those who hold power can be made to question their actions when they are held accountable. As Alana exited the plane, she was met by the usual bustle of the airport. But as she moved through the crowd, she felt a new sense of clarity. This had been more than just a battle over a seat. It had been a confrontation with the systems that sought to impose control, to diminish individuals, especially those who were often invisible in society's gaze. Alana had stood her ground, but she knew that this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. The story would ripple out, like the waves that follow a stone cast into still water. People would talk about it. They would remember how she had refused to let herself be dismissed. The flight attendants would go home, perhaps thinking twice about how they treated passengers. The captain might reflect on how the balance of power can so easily shift when you least expect it. And those who witnessed it, whether they realized it or not, would carry that moment with them. Alana walked out of the terminal with her head held high, her body language exuding the quiet confidence of someone who had just changed the course of her own destiny. The world may not have been changed in that one moment, but her small victory was a spark in the larger conversation about power, respect, and human dignity. She knew this story would travel far. It would be told in quiet whispers and in loud conversations alike. People would find their own voices in the echoes of her words. And for Alana, that was enough. Because in the end, real change begins with one courageous person who refuses to back down, who refuses to be silenced. And Alana Brooks had just started a revolution, one moment, one flight, one unapologetic stand at a time.